Dakota Theriot. While the term brutal is often used to describe this case, it is an inadequate word for the events that unfolded. On the morning of Saturday, January 26, 2019, law enforcement in Livingston Parish received a dispatch, a call that should have been an isolated incident confined to one family's home. The call was triggered by a neighbor who had just been approached by two very young children, only 7 and 1 years of age. The children were seeking refuge. Once deputies arrived at the source of the disturbance, the Earnest family home on Courtney Road near Walker, they uncovered a horrific scene. 3 individuals were deceased inside. The victims were identified as Billy Earnest, his daughter, Summer Earnest, and his son, Tanner Earnest. Investigators would later determine the cause of death for all 3 was a single gunshot wound to the head. The timeline they constructed placed the start of the massacre at around 8 a.m. Dakota Michael Theriot was 21 years old at the time. He was romantically involved with Summer Earnest and had been living inside the Earnest home for the preceding few weeks. This detail was critical. It immediately defined the crime not as a random home invasion, but as something personal, originating from within. The threat had come from someone already inside their circle of trust. During initial press briefings, the Sheriff's Department publicly categorized the event in terms of domestic violence. However, even as investigators began to reconstruct the timeline, a motive remained disturbingly absent. But the crime scene on Courtney Road was not the end of this story. It was merely the first stop. The murder of 3 family members was, inexplicably, only the beginning. Theriot absconded from the Earnest home in Billy Earnest's pickup truck, driving into the adjacent Ascension Parish and making his way towards Gonzales. This distance wasn't a guess. Investigators confirmed the journey was approximately 25 miles. Officials stated that as the neighbor was making the 911 call in Livingston Parish, the next violent chapter was already unfolding in Gonzales, within Ascension Parish. The second location was shockingly familiar. His own parents' residence on Church Point Road. Local media reports placed the time of that shooting at shortly before 9 a.m. Ascension Parish Sheriff Bobby Weber later revealed that one of the victims was able to communicate with deputies before both individuals eventually succumbed to their wounds. ABC reported that Keith Theriot, Dakota's father, though gravely wounded, managed to call the authorities after being shot. During that call, he identified the gunman as his own son. This was one of the most critical pieces of live intelligence investigators received, as it connected the 2 crime scenes in the present moment, not just in retrospect. In the weeks preceding the murders, Theriot's own parents had ordered him out of their home, which led directly to him being taken in by the family of his girlfriend. Keith Theriot and Elizabeth Theriot were transported to a hospital, but both would later die. Subsequent autopsy reports would state the cause of death was gunshot wounds to the head and facial area, a detail consistent with the findings for the 3 victims in Livingston Parish. Over the course of a single morning, 5 people were dead, 2 families were shattered, and the devastation crossed 2 parish lines. The suspect was no longer in the state of Louisiana. He had fled immediately after the slayings. As soon as the second crime scene was confirmed, the case transformed from a homicide investigation into a desperate manhunt. Authorities issued a bulletin describing Theriot as armed and dangerous, and confirmed he was driving the stolen truck. The case quickly expanded beyond Louisiana. Law enforcement tracked the vehicle all the way to Virginia, to Richmond County, near the town of Warsaw where Theriot's grandmother resided. Accounts of the eventual arrest depict a moment of extreme tension. A relative had requested that deputies check on the residence, and while they were present, Theriot arrived. Officers reported that he brandished a firearm through the window of his vehicle. Deputies immediately took cover, issued verbal commands, and he complied, dropping the weapon before being taken into custody. In the wake of his capture, some facts of the case became clear to the public, while others remained stubbornly opaque. Authorities reported that he had confessed, and years later, during court proceedings, a deputy from Ascension Parish testified that Theriot made a stark admission following his arrest, characterizing the murders as pure cold blood. Even so, The Associated Press later reported that while he had given investigators substantial information on the mechanics of the killings, a clear motive remained elusive. This combination of detailed cooperation on the facts, paired with the complete absence of a simple motive, meant the case never felt fully resolved. Even with the suspect apprehended, the legal journey that followed would extend for years. Early in 2019, prosecutors declared they would seek the death penalty, a case complicated by the fact that it had to proceed through two separate parishes, Livingston and Ascension. The trial was beset by delays, including significant interruptions caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. Then, on January 11, 2023, the case concluded not with a jury verdict, but with a plea deal. We rely on viewer support to continue producing content. As this channel is still in its early phase, we would be grateful for your support by subscribing and liking this video. We thank you for your support. Theriot pleaded guilty to 5 counts of first-degree murder, receiving a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. In Livingston Parish, Judge Brenda Ricks handed down 3 life sentences to be served without the benefit of probation, parole, or suspension of sentence. Later that same day in Ascension Parish, Judge Jason Verdigan added 2 additional life sentences, also to be served concurrently. The district attorney confirmed that he would serve his sentence at the Angola prison. Following this, prosecutors explained the plea's significance, which went beyond mere punishment. District Attorney Scott Perilou acknowledged that while the facts warranted a death sentence, it would trap the victims' families in a cycle of prolonged, possibly endless litigation. He confirmed the families were in agreement with the plea and the resulting sentence. The Associated Press later reported that Perilou cited Thio's extensive psychological records, which documented a long history of mental illness. These details would become integral to the public's understanding of the case. It wasn't just about the crime itself, but about the resolution the justice system chose: the certainty of life without parole over the grueling uncertainty of capital litigation. The case's national resonance wouldn't be found in legislation bearing a victim's name. Instead, it became a reference point in the ongoing national conversation, a chilling example of domestic violence escalating into mass murder. It illustrated the terrifying speed at which a private relationship can devolve into a multi-victim family slaughter, and it sparked debate over why he was granted a life sentence instead of facing the death penalty. The name is Bunak Hannah Landon. The date? The morning of April 26, 2023. The setting? Harahan, a quiet suburb in Jefferson Parish, nestled just outside the familiar streets of New Orleans. A father walked into a police station with a story of every parent's worst nightmare. His 6-year-old daughter had disappeared. Just hours before, she was safe in her bedroom. Now, she was gone, and the woman who was supposed to be watching her had vanished as well. Before the day was over, a routine missing child report would escalate into one of the most disturbing child homicide cases in the history of Jefferson Parish. The horror wasn't defined by the location, but by the person who was inside the home when the unthinkable occurred. Her name was Bella Fontanille. She was 6 years old, a kindergartner at St. Matthew the Apostle School, navigating the separate worlds of her parents' homes as part of a custody arrangement. At her father's residence in the Imperial Woods subdivision, a central figure was his longtime girlfriend, Bunak Hannah Landon. She was an established fixture in Bella's daily routine. Landon had been with Bella's father for years, frequently entrusted with the care of both Bella and her older sister. This was not some unknown predator. This was a person deep inside the family circle. In the days leading up to April 25th, trial testimony would reveal that Bella's teacher had observed a change in the little girl's demeanor, noting that she had begun to cry more often. The child appeared anxious and had started to articulate a specific fear, a fear connected to being at her father's house. She reportedly told her teacher, "Miss Hannah is mean." According to reporting from Fox 8 Live, those simple words, presented during the trial, would become a cornerstone of the prosecution's narrative. But at the time, they were just observations, warning signs that would only be understood in hindsight. On April 25th of 2023, Bella and her sister enjoyed a routine afternoon visit with their paternal grandmother. This visit would be the last confirmed time anyone saw Bella alive, aside from Landon herself. Later that evening, their grandmother dropped the girls off at their father's house in Harahan. Bella's father wasn't home that night, but Hannah Landon was. At some point in the hours after the grandmother drove away, Bella was murdered. The Jefferson Parish Coroner's Office would later determine the cause of death: asphyxia due to strangulation, combined with blunt force trauma. It was a medical finding that, as reported by multiple media outlets, including People magazine, established that the little girl had been both strangled and beaten. Her death was immediately ruled a homicide, and what happened next would become the central, chilling pillar of the case. In the pre-dawn darkness of April 26th, neighborhood surveillance cameras captured a haunting image: Hannah Landon pulling a child's wagon through the silent streets of Imperial Woods. Inside that wagon sat a large plastic bucket, and inside the bucket, she had placed the little girl's body. The footage documented her entire journey, walking the wagon to the home of Bella's biological mother, leaving the bucket on the front lawn, and then calmly returning, the wagon now empty. Her movements were methodical, her path direct. It was later that same morning when Bella's father awoke to find the house strangely empty. Both Bella and Hannah Landon were gone. He immediately drove to the Harahan Police Department to file a missing persons report. Officers responded with urgency. As they began to canvass the area, they made a grisly discovery on the lawn of Bola's mother: the plastic bucket. Inside, they found Bola's body. Within hours, a missing child case had become a full-blown homicide investigation. The girl's father was left shattered, reeling in shock and grief. The family was left to mourn a 6-year-old child who had been returned home, seemingly safe, by her grandmother just the night before. Investigators immediately began to reconstruct the timeline of the murder, piecing together surveillance footage and digital evidence. According to evidence presented at trial, Landon's first move after the killing was to bury her cell phone in a neighbor's yard. Prosecutors would also introduce evidence showing that she had searched online for criminal defense attorneys and sent messages before eventually going to the police station. She eventually surfaced at the Harahan Police Department sometime after midnight, where she was then taken for a hospital evaluation. These actions would prove critical at trial. They were presented not merely as evidence, but as clear indicators of her awareness of the crime. When formal charges were filed, Landon entered her plea: not guilty by reason of insanity. Her defense team would argue that she was in the throes of a severe mental illness at the time of the killing, and therefore could not comprehend the nature of her actions. The prosecution, however, presented a chilling counter-narrative. They detailed her calculated efforts to cover her tracks, moving the body, burying the phone, and conducting incriminating searches. These actions, they argued, proved she understood the gravity of her crime. The trial convened in Jefferson Parish in 2025. The jury was presented with a mosaic of evidence, hearing from Bella's teacher, her family, the investigators who worked the case, forensic specialists, and experts in mental health. They watched the haunting surveillance video of the wagon. They were told the story of the bucket. Medical experts testified, detailing the precise cause of death. The timeline was critical: the narrow window between the grandmother's departure and the father's horrifying discovery. In the end, it was a question of sanity versus a calculated cover-up. On May 1st, 2025, the jury made its decision, formally rejecting the insanity defense. Bunnock Hannah Landon was convicted of first-degree murder and 2 counts of obstruction of justice. Under Louisiana law, the finding carried an automatic, unyielding sentence: life in prison. 5 days later, inside a Gretna courtroom at the Jefferson Parish Courthouse, the final chapter was written. For the murder of Bella Fontanelle, Landon was formally sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. On top of that, she received additional decades for the obstruction charges, creating a sentence of life plus years. The court then heard the victim impact statements. Family members spoke of the profound void left by a 6-year-old girl whose life had only just begun. The case resonated far beyond Louisiana, capturing national attention. The media narrative was stark and consistent. A child murdered by a trusted caregiver in the presumed safety of her own home. The specific, chilling details, like the observations from the teacher, ignited a nationwide conversation about the hidden dangers for children in blended families and contentious custody disputes. The name is Derek Groves. The date, February 13th, 2018. In New Orleans, the Mardi Gras celebration was already electric, even before the clock struck noon. In the Ninth Ward, at the corner of St. Claude Avenue and Andrew Street, a crowd had formed outside a residence in the 5400 block. It was a scene that embodies the soul of the city, a neighborhood block party. Families milled about, children played, and neighbors chatted in small groups. But as this festive scene unfolded, a vehicle slowly approached the corner. Seconds later, the celebration was shattered by the sound of gunfire. The 911 dispatch board lit up with call after call, reporting shots fired. When officers secured the scene, they found 5 people hit by the gunfire. 2 would not survive the assault. Jamar Robinson and Byron Jackson were declared dead. 3 others, Eric Robinson, Fred Henry, and Dalvin Wright, were wounded but would live. Investigators immediately faced the daunting task of reconstructing those violent seconds, canvassing the chaotic scene for witnesses. Based on testimony later documented in the Louisiana Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals decision in State v. Groves, Eric Robinson recounted for the jury how he was standing outside his aunt's home when a car appeared at Andre and St. Claude. He testified he was just 5 feet from the assailants when they opened fire. In court, he pointed to 2 men as the gunmen, Derek Groves and Kendall Barnes. This detail is crucial because the prosecution's case was not about a random act of violence. It was, they argued, a targeted assassination. Another witness, Richard Green, took the stand and testified to his belief that he was the person they had come for that day. He also conceded that he fled before police arrived and was initially uncooperative, a point of contention during the trial. That reluctance to come forward highlighted the immense challenge for law enforcement. They were dealing with a scene of utter chaos, multiple casualties, and a wall of silence from witnesses hesitant to get involved. A grand jury eventually returned indictments against Derek Groves and Kendall Barnes for their alleged roles in the shooting, setting in motion a legal battle that would span several years. The case navigated a complex path of appeals and even a retrial, yet the central accusation never wavered. Groves and Barnes were the men accused of unleashing a hail of bullets on that neighborhood gathering. In October of 2024, a jury found Derek Groves guilty on 2 counts of second-degree murder for the slayings of Jamar Robinson and Byron Jackson. He was also found guilty on 2 counts of attempted second-degree murder related to 2 of the individuals who survived. Although there were 3 survivors in total, the final sentencing would reflect convictions for 2 counts of attempted murder. But Groves's legal troubles extended far beyond the events of that Mardi Gras. He subsequently entered a guilty plea to 2 counts of manslaughter, acknowledging his role in 2 entirely separate fatal shootings. As his sentencing date loomed, he was no longer just a man on trial for a double homicide. He was a man legally connected to multiple killings. On December 12, 2025, ad hoc Judge Dennis Waldron handed down the sentence for the Mardi Gras murders. 2 consecutive life terms for Derek Groves. For the attempted second-degree murder convictions, he received 2 additional 50-year sentences. News reports from the time confirmed that all sentences were ordered to be served one after the other. In the courtroom, the judge spoke to the profound brutality of the crimes and the devastating impact on the victims' families. The defense team affirmed their client's innocence and intent to appeal, but at the trial court level, the judgment was absolute. At that moment, the book was closed on a long and violent chapter. Groves was being held at the Orleans Parish Justice Center. Then, on May 16, 2025, the narrative of his incarceration fractured in a way no one saw coming. That morning, a head count revealed a chilling reality. 10 inmates had vanished. Among them was Derek Groves, a man convicted for the killing of 2 people during a public Mardi Gras celebration. Subsequent investigations would uncover a sophisticated plan, one that exploited a vulnerability in the very bones of the facility. The plumbing infrastructure concealed behind a toilet. An opening had been carved out, just wide enough for a human body to slip through the wall and into the shadows. Media reports detailed the crude but effective tools used in the breach, among them a set of electric hair clippers, repurposed for escape. The narrative quickly turned to internal failure, with allegations of lapses in monitoring, alongside the explosive accusation that a maintenance worker may have aided the breakout. Every gap in surveillance and supervision was placed under a microscope. Critically, the breach wasn't detected in real time. By the time the alarm was finally raised, the 10 missing inmates had a significant head start, triggering a sprawling, multi-agency manhunt. The U.S. Marshals Service entered the fray. Crime Stoppers, hotlines lit up. The search radiated outward, with law enforcement alerts crossing state lines. Within weeks, most of the escapees were rounded up and returned to custody, but Derek Groves remained a ghost. For 5 months, he evaded capture. Then, on October 8, 2025, the trail led investigators to Atlanta, Georgia. They located him concealed within the tight confines of a residential crawl space. To force him out, authorities deployed gas before moving in to make the arrest. A Crime Stoppers tip proved to be the critical piece of intelligence. The manhunt was over, but the examination of how it happened was just beginning. The Livingston Parish jailbreak was cast by national media as one of the most significant correctional security failures in recent memory. Official reports highlighted a cascade of failures: structural vulnerabilities in the building itself, insufficient monitoring, immense pressures on staffing, and a complete breakdown in contraband control. This kind of breach sends ripples through correctional systems nationwide, a stark case study in how layers of security can disintegrate when physical weaknesses and human error intersect. For the families of Jamar Robinson and Byron Jackson, the news was devastating. It resurrected a terror that his conviction was supposed to have buried forever. The man who had taken their loved ones from them was free. Even that temporary freedom was enough to shatter public confidence. The story of Derek Groves is more than just an act of violence on Mardi Gras Day. It is a story about the collision of lethal violence and catastrophic institutional failure. One event destroyed lives in an instant. The other exposed just how vulnerable a secure facility can be from within. Which brings us to the case of Tiffany Woods. As we explore what happened, consider a question: is this a story of justice or a profound injustice? In late August of 2005, it felt as if the world itself was on the verge of breaking. Hurricane Katrina was churning toward the coast of southeast Louisiana. Families were making impossible choices, packing what they could into cars and joining the exodus. Among them were Tiffany Monique Woods and Emmanuel Scott, fleeing New Orleans with their 4 small children. Their youngest, a son named Emmanuel Scott, Jr., had just been born on June 23, 2005. He had arrived prematurely, and medical staff had already flagged health concerns that demanded careful follow-up. He was a fragile infant long before a hurricane began to form in the Gulf. The family traveled approximately 320 miles northwest, seeking refuge near Shreveport. Like countless other evacuees, they were adrift in a world of temporary housing and shelters. Then Katrina hit. The levees broke. New Orleans was submerged. The entire infrastructure of care hospitals, clinics, social services was either crippled or gone. In this new reality, routine pediatric care vanished. Securing a follow-up appointment was a monumental task. Stability was a memory. In the weeks following the evacuation, the infant began to fail. Court records show he became dangerously lethargic and struggled to feed. By October of 2005, he was just over 3 months old. His delicate health demanded consistent medical monitoring and precise nutrition. These were not abstract requirements. They were matters of life and death. And by that October, the family's vouchers for baby formula were depleted. The official record states that Woods and Scott made a fateful choice. They began feeding the infant organic cow's milk, later telling investigators they hoped he would tolerate it better. It was a decision the state would later seize upon, arguing that this choice combined with a failure to seek medical help as his condition deteriorated, constituted cruelty to a juvenile under Louisiana law. On October 25, 2005, a call was made to emergency services in Shreveport. The baby was found unresponsive. He was pronounced dead. An autopsy identified the cause of death as severe malnutrition. That clinical finding would become the cornerstone of the state's case against his parents. This was not investigated as a tragic accident born of circumstance. It was prosecuted as a homicide. The specific framework of Louisiana's second-degree murder statute would dictate everything that came next, as a death occurring during another felony like cruelty to a juvenile qualifies as second-degree murder. Under this statute, prosecutors do not have to prove an intent to kill if the death results from that underlying felony, and the penalty is not negotiable. It is a mandatory sentence, life in prison, at hard labor, with no possibility of parole, probation, or suspension of sentence. At the center of the tragedy were two figures, Tiffany Woods, the child's 25-year-old mother, and Emmanuel Scott, who was 18. The charge against them was second-degree murder. Their case was heard in a joint bench trial, and the Louisiana Second Circuit Court of Appeal would later review the proceedings. The trial court determined that the evidence overwhelmingly pointed to cruelty to a juvenile, concluding the infant's death was a direct result of malnutrition from the couple's actions and their failure to act. The verdict was guilty for both. The sentence was absolute, life in prison, without the possibility of parole. An appeal was filed, prompting the appellate court to meticulously re-examine the evidence against the existing legal statutes. In a formal written opinion, the higher court saw no reason to overturn the lower court's decision, affirming both convictions and the life sentences. The ruling was starkly clear. Once the legal requirements for cruelty to a juvenile were met and a death occurred, the law was unyielding. A second-degree murder conviction was not just supported, it was legally mandated under Louisiana's framework. The sentence of life without parole was not a choice. It was a requirement. For many years, this judgment seemed to be the final word on the matter. Two parents were condemned to spend their lives in prison for the death of their infant son, a tragedy born from the chaos left by Hurricane Katrina. But the story refused to be buried. It would reemerge years later, framed by a completely different set of questions. In 2021, the Marshall Project cast a new light on the Woods case, analyzing it through the lens of Louisiana's severe sentencing laws and the larger national discourse on extreme punishment. The investigation revisited the turmoil of the Katrina displacement and the profound instability that plagued the young family. It also examined the infant's premature birth and the inflexible nature of the state's murder statute. The case was held up as a chilling example of how a death caused by neglect, without any proof of an intent to harm, could inexorably lead to a mandatory sentence of life without parole. This reframing elevated the case from a single, tragic courtroom drama. It became a centerpiece in national conversations about justice, parental failure, and how the chaos of a natural disaster can blur the lines of responsibility. Advocates for reform pointed to it as proof that mandatory life sentences erase critical context. In contrast, opponents argued that the infant's horrific suffering justified the unyielding penalty. Then, in August of 2023, the Louisiana Board of Pardons convened to hear Tiffany Woods' appeal for commutation. The official record shows the board's decision was unanimous, a 4-0 vote recommending her sentence be reduced to 36 years. The Associated Press covered the hearing, detailing the proceedings for the public. The report highlighted Woods' own admission of making catastrophic mistakes during a time defined by desperation, displacement, and deep depression. The prosecution vehemently fought the commutation, pointing to the child's emaciated condition and insisting that the original life sentence was the only appropriate justice. This recommendation for clemency was not an exoneration. It didn't invalidate the court's ruling, but it fundamentally altered the narrative. The case became a volatile flashpoint in the state's ongoing battles over clemency and sentencing reform. It was now being cited nationwide in debates over whether a life without parole sentence, typically reserved for intentional killers, should apply to deaths rooted in severe neglect. For some, The facts painted a clear picture of criminal negligence that led directly to a child's death. For others, it was a stark illustration of how rigid laws can deliver outcomes that make no allowance for the chaos of disaster, the immaturity of youth, or the subtle but critical gradations of intent. Does a ruling like this align with our sense of justice? Considering the unprecedented devastation of Hurricane Katrina, one has to ask, was the punishment proportionate to the crime, or was this sentence an extreme overreach? This is Jonathan Robinson. Most acts of violence seek the cover of darkness, but this was different. What kind of mind invites the entire world to witness a murder? What compels a man to kill his former lover, not in secret, but on a public stage? The date was April 12, 2018. The place was Shreveport, Louisiana. A notification appeared on countless phones, a simple Facebook Live alert, but for those who tapped on the screen, there was no way to know they were about to become unwitting spectators to the last moments of 27-year-old Renita Nunu Williams. The broadcast was already in progress. The comments from viewers were already scrolling across the screen. And somewhere within that home on Natalie Street, Jonathan Robinson was with her. What happened in the moments that followed would transcend a typical murder investigation. It would become a seminal case in the national dialogue about violence on social media. A chilling exploration of what it means when a death is not discovered after the fact, but is instead broadcast to the world as it unfolds. Renita Williams was a mother. She had 3 children. Contemporary news reports identified Jonathan Robinson as her ex-boyfriend, and the relationship had already violently disintegrated. Investigations revealed that Robinson was no stranger to violence. He had a significant and brutal criminal history. His record included prior convictions and arrests for armed robbery and shootings, which established a clear and disturbing pattern of escalating criminal behavior long before April 2018. This history is crucial because the event was not a random act of public violence captured by a bystander. According to investigative reports, Robinson confessed in a recorded interview that the entire event was premeditated. He stated unequivocally to investigators that he went to the house with the specific intention of killing her. This admission places his intent at the very heart of the crime. That day, Robinson had forced his way into the residence. Williams was already streaming live on her Facebook account. Those watching the feed would later describe an undeniable sense of dread. News outlet KSLA confirmed that Robinson compelled Williams to make a public apology to his new girlfriend during the broadcast. This specific act of compelling a televised apology is a matter of record in both court transcripts and official investigation files. It was an exhibition of dominance, degradation, and psychological pressure, all performed for a live audience. The broadcast was more than a recording of a physical assault. It was a real-time documentation of subjugation. Then, at an unknown moment within the stream, Jonathan Robinson shot Renita Williams. Her life was taken inside the residence as an online audience witnessed fragments of the horrifying encounter. Media reports later verified that the transmission ceased immediately following the sound of shots. This was not a curated story or a pre-recorded video. The event unfolded in the present moment. Law enforcement was dispatched, but the situation devolved into a tense, armed confrontation that stretched for approximately 80 minutes. Robinson was fortified inside, armed with a semi-automatic rifle. Nearly 30 rounds were discharged in the ensuing firefight with Shreveport police. A total of 8 officers were engaged in the shootout. Amid the exchange, Officer Robert Ontrekin sustained a gunshot wound to his wrist, an injury later confirmed in Associated Press reports. In his subsequent confession to investigators, Robinson admitted his intent during the standoff was lethal. Investigative reports from KSLA, citing his taped confession, confirmed that the protracted standoff eventually concluded, with Robinson being taken into custody. By then, the live recording had gone viral. The incident ignited a firestorm across social media as news blogs disseminated the story nationwide. An unseen audience had already observed a portion of the brutal assault long before law enforcement had even established a perimeter. This is the point at which the case's repercussions started to radiate far beyond the crime scene. The ensuing investigation would pivot on more than just conventional forensics. It depended heavily on the digital artifact of the live stream itself. In a modern crime of this nature, the digital file serves as an immutable, time-stamped account of presence, dialogue, and coercion, and the sequence of events. On January 24, 2019, Jonathan Robinson entered a guilty plea to first-degree murder in the death of Rianita Williams. The terms of his plea bargain mandated a life sentence with no possibility of parole. He was also handed a concurrent 100-year sentence for the assault on police. Inside the courtroom during sentencing, Robinson turned to the victim's mother, Anita Williams. He offered a formal apology, and in response, she stated that she forgave him. This interaction stands as one of the most widely reported and emotional moments of the trial, though it had no bearing on his sentence. It couldn't reverse the past, yet it was forever etched into the official narrative of the case. By then, the incident's notoriety had already escaped the confines of Shreveport. The case was cited by national media in debates concerning content moderation and the profound psychological impact of viewing raw violence online. Analysts highlighted how live broadcasting fundamentally alters emergency response dynamics. The public can alert authorities in real time, but this immediacy also transforms the nature of trauma exposure. The crime scene is no longer a contained space. The public becomes a global audience, and rather than seeing static images of the aftermath, they experience the unfolding terror of a death as it happens. Monica Every and Lewis Gordon. On the morning of January 27, 2022, Charlene Jones left her Metairie apartment and headed toward her car, preparing for her workday. In Livingston Parish, it was a completely unremarkable weekday. Nothing in the quiet parking lot gave any indication of the violence that was moments away. Seconds later, 3 gunshots shattered the morning calm. Charlene Jones died on the pavement, just steps from her own front door. But the events of that morning were not spontaneous. Their origins traced back a month prior to Christmas Day, 2021. On a day typically reserved for celebration, a relationship was ending. Reginald Anderson had broken things off with Monica Every. Shortly thereafter, he started a new relationship with Charlene Jones. What should have been a difficult but private separation would soon become dangerously public. Over the ensuing weeks, Monica Every initiated a campaign of relentless contact directed at both Anderson and Jones. Phone calls and messages became a constant intrusion. Her actions then escalated when she contacted the management of Jones's apartment building with false claims about Anderson. She proceeded to fax materials related to a prior manslaughter case against Anderson that originated from Tangipahoa Parish. This was no longer the emotional fallout of a breakup. Her actions had become calculated and deliberate. It was during this time frame that Lewis Gordon became involved, the man who would eventually face trial as the triggerman. Prior to the murder, he was contracted to carry out what prosecutors would later label in court as intimidation tasks targeting Jones. Testimony presented to the jury revealed that he had been paid to scatter a substance described as voodoo dust across Jones's vehicle. Further testimony alleged a gun was planted inside her car, followed by a tip to law enforcement in a clear attempt to frame her. These were not simple acts of mischief. They were methodical steps in a growing campaign of terror that was reaching its violent conclusion. Monica Every offered Lewis Gordon $10,000 for the murder of Charlene Jones. On January 27, 2022, Gordon proceeded to the apartment building where Jones resided. Model. Approaching her vehicle, she was struck by 3 bullets. Her life ended right there on the pavement. The path to the killer was paved with digital breadcrumbs, cameras, cell phones, and financial records. Security video pinpointed a 2013 Ford Fusion lurking at the complex near the time of the murder. Investigators traced the vehicle to Deja Walls, Gordon's girlfriend. Her cell phone pinged at the murder scene. Under questioning, Walls claimed Gordon had borrowed her car and her daughter's phone, telling her he was running errands for Monica Every. The money told its own dark story. A $4,000 Capital One check surfaced, deposited into the account of Gordon's mother. From there, funds were funneled to Gordon through Cash App. Weaving together surveillance footage, digital forensics, and transaction histories, detectives constructed a chilling timeline. With the pieces in place, arrest warrants were issued. On July 14, 2022, the official charges came down. Monica Every and Lewis Gordon were indicted for second-degree murder and conspiracy to commit the same. For Every, an additional charge was added: solicitation for murder. Gordon's indictment included felon in possession of a firearm and obstruction of justice. The stage was set for a trial in Jefferson Parish. The jury delivered its verdict. Lewis Gordon was found guilty of second-degree murder. Monica Every was convicted as a principal to that murder, in addition to conspiracy and solicitation. With that conviction, the court's hands were tied on the primary charge. On May 29, 2025, inside the 24th Judicial District Court, Judge R. Christopher Cox III presided. Both defendants received a mandatory sentence of life in prison. Gordon's sentence was extended for obstruction of justice, a term to be served consecutively. At the sentencing hearing, one of Charlene Jones's daughters faced Monica Every in court and uttered the chilling words, "You got my mother murdered." The verdict itself laid bare the architecture of Louisiana's law concerning murder for hire plots. The individual who pulls the trigger is culpable for murder, but the one who orchestrates and finances the act is just as guilty as a principal. The pact to kill constitutes conspiracy. The asking becomes solicitation. Hiring a killer creates no legal shield. The law eliminates that distance entirely. Eureka Rochelle Black. At 10:53 a.m. on September 24, 2021, a call came into Shreveport Police Dispatch. A child was in the water near the Cross Lake Bridge. Patrol and Marine units were immediately dispatched to the location. But what first responders discovered upon arrival transformed the mission from a rescue to a homicide investigation. They located an infant boy in the lake. He was pulled from the water and pronounced dead on sight. Authorities swept the area, acting on initial reports that more children could be in danger. In the midst of that search, they found a 5-year-old boy, alive but in the water. He was rescued and rushed to Ochsner LSU Health. His injuries initially deemed life-threatening. Initial confusion over a possible third child was eventually resolved. There was no third victim in the lake. The Caddo Parish Coroner's Office identified the infant as 10-month-old Joshua Black. The survivor was his older brother, 5-year-old Elijah Black. The mother of both boys was Eureka Rochelle Black. She, however, was nowhere near the bridge. Detectives from the Shreveport Police Department's violent crimes and crime scene units began to process the area. This, according to the department's press release from September 27, 2021. Crime scene technicians collected video footage and other key evidence, while detectives started questioning potential witnesses. At the hospital, they interviewed young Elijah. He told them his mother had pushed him into the water, describing how they had been at the top of the bridge. He mentioned something about germs. Trial records would later show he claimed his mother told him he had germs and that the lake was good water. In subsequent interviews with child advocacy specialists, interviews later played for the jury, he revealed she told him he needed to go with God. These accounts would form the very core of the prosecution's case. As detectives absorbed this disturbing information, a separate effort was already in motion, locating Eureka Rochelle Black. Investigators connected her to a gray Dodge Caravan with Texas plates. Leveraging all available investigative tools and coordinating between agencies, law enforcement began tracking the van's movements. They found her at a rest stop in Wascom, Texas, just across the Louisiana border. She was apprehended without incident. KSLA would later clarify that she was first arrested by Wascom police right at the state line before her transport back to Shreveport. She was then booked into the Caddo Correctional Center. A Caddo Parish grand jury handed down an indictment for second-degree murder in the death of Joshua and attempted second-degree murder for what she did to Elijah. There were no public reports of digital records, written manifestos, or any kind of documented preparation for the act. The prosecution's case, as revealed in public records, would hinge on the physical crime scene and the chilling testimony of a child, the collected evidence, and the established timeline. As the case proceeded to trial in 2023, a highly unusual development took place. Eureka Rochelle Black elected to serve as her own attorney. She opted to represent herself in court, despite having standby counsel available from the public defender's office. The jurors were made to watch video footage from an interview conducted at the Gingerbread House Child Advocacy Center. Elijah took the stand, testifying briefly in person. On September 13, 2023, the prosecution built its case, presenting recorded statements and tangible evidence. In the end, the jury returned a verdict. They found her guilty of second-degree murder and attempted second-degree murder. Her fate was decided on September 28, 2023. According to records from KSLA and the Caddo Parish Clerk of Court, the judgment was severe: life imprisonment for the count of second-degree murder and 50 years for the attempted second-degree murder. The court stipulated that the sentences would run concurrently. In accordance with Louisiana state law, her life sentence was absolute, with no provision for probation. The case captured national attention, disseminated by the Associated Press and covered by major outlets including Law and Crime and People. Across the nation, headlines framed the events through the chilling lens of parental violence and filicide. Relatives would later state publicly what they had suspected for years, that there were profound mental health issues at play. The case is still referenced in discussions about parental filicide and systemic responses, not for changing laws, but for the sheer, stark horror of its details. Robert Marks. On June 8, 2016, Lintel Washington walked out of her home, her 3-year-old daughter by her side. On the surface, it was an ordinary evening. No one could have known that the events about to unfold would be dissected in courtrooms, preserved in appellate records, and ignite a national conversation about violence toward pregnant women. Washington was a respected educator, a teacher at the Brookstown Middle Magnet Academy in Baton Rouge. Her professional life was thriving. She'd been named Teacher of the Year for the 2014-2015 academic year, and by early June, she was also deep into her pregnancy, approximately 7 months along. Working at the very same school was the assistant principal, Robert Marks. He was a married man who was also entangled in an affair with Washington. Friends would later recall Washington's growing realization, a painful truth she had recently come to accept. Marks had no intention of leaving his wife for her, despite his promises. This escalating tension, investigators would later contend, became the core of the motive presented by the state during the trial. But on that day, June 8, 2016, this dark, underlying context remained hidden from view. The first thread investigators would pull was a digital one, a footprint left by their cell phones. An examination of phone records would reveal that around 9:45 p.m., both Washington's and Marks's phones were pinging in the Rama area of Iberville Parish, approximately 25 miles west of Baton Rouge. For a crucial 15-minute window, the phones stayed in that location before they began moving back toward Baton Rouge. This short span of time would become one of the first concrete pieces of evidence in the timeline investigators were building. The next break in the case came from the most vulnerable of witnesses, a child. Washington's 3-year-old daughter was found wandering alone near her mother's car in the 11,000 block of Newcastle Avenue in Baton Rouge. No adult was anywhere in sight, and when officers looked inside the vehicle, they found blood. The entire complexion of the case shifted in that instant. This was no longer a standard missing persons report. The blood was a clear indicator of violence. The search quickly intensified, spreading out from Baton Rouge. Days later, their worst fears were realized. A body was found in a ditch in Iberville Parish, near Rosedale. The victim was identified as Lintel Washington. An autopsy revealed the cause of death, a single gunshot wound to the head. The coroner's report also concluded that her unborn child perished as a direct consequence of the fatal wound inflicted upon the mother. There was no evidence of separate trauma to the fetus, a medical finding that would have immediate and profound legal ramifications. According to Louisiana revised statute, a charge of first-degree feticide is applicable when an unborn child is killed during the commission of another serious felony, such as second-degree murder. Consequently, prosecutors didn't just charge Robert Marks with second-degree murder for Washington's death. They added the charge of first-degree feticide for the death of her unborn child. The indictment, therefore, officially recognized two distinct victims under the eyes of Louisiana law. As investigators pieced together the sequence of events, they sat down for a forensic interview with Washington's young daughter. The little girl told them that Mr. Robbie had hurt her mommy. She recalled hearing a bang. She described her mother shaking. And then, she said, her mother was in the lake. These haunting statements from a child would become a cornerstone of the prosecution's narrative at trial. But the digital trail from that evening had more to reveal. It was later confirmed that another woman, Trawikia Jackson, was also in contact with Marks that night, exchanging phone calls and text messages. Investigators would eventually place her near the very location where Washington's child was abandoned, having been picked up there. Authorities made it clear that Jackson cooperated fully with the investigation and was not implicated in the murder or the abandonment of the child. On the stand, Jackson testified that she was also in an intimate relationship with Robert Marks in June of 2016. She recounted that on the night of June 8th, Marks had called her around 11:30 p.m., asking for a ride. She drove to Newcastle Avenue near Sherwood Forest Boulevard, and that is where she picked him up. A nearby bank's security camera captured Jackson retrieving him at 11:37 p.m. Jackson would later testify that Marks was dressed head to toe in motorcycle attire, a leather jacket, jeans, boots, gloves, and a helmet. She then transported him to a Baker Walmart, dropping him off in the parking lot where he had left his motorcycle. While Marks was initially apprehended on charges related to abandoning the child, the case against him deepened as the investigation uncovered more sinister evidence. The list of accusations grew to include second-degree murder, first-degree feticide, and second-degree kidnapping, along with aggravated kidnapping of a child, obstruction of justice, carjacking, and multiple firearm offenses. The case wound its way through the justice system, finally culminating in a trial. In December of 2021, jury selection commenced in Baton Rouge. The prosecution laid out its evidence, which featured damning cell phone location data, harrowing testimony about the discovery of the child, and forensic details concerning the blood discovered inside Washington's car. Jurors were presented with grim video from the crime scene and stark autopsy photographs, though appellate court filings would later show disputes over whether some of this evidence should have been admitted. Washington's own daughter was called to the stand to testify, but her account was understandably constrained by her extreme youth when the crime occurred. Other family members, including Washington's twin sister, also gave testimony, while the defense maintained that the prosecution's entire case was built on circumstantial evidence. In a startling move, trial records show the defense team called no witnesses and offered no closing argument. After a period of deliberation, the jury found him guilty of second-degree murder, first-degree feticide, and second-degree kidnapping. He was also convicted of aggravated kidnapping of a child, obstruction of justice, carjacking, and all associated firearms charges. His sentencing was held on February 10, 2022. For the murder of Washington, Robert Marks was handed a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole, a mandatory sentence under Louisiana state law. Further life in prison terms were added for the other convictions. The case was later examined by the Louisiana First Circuit Court of Appeal, which upheld both the convictions and the sentences. The court only sent back a minor sentencing issue that had no bearing on his life terms. By convicting Marks of both second-degree murder and first-degree feticide, the jury activated a specific legal framework that treats an unborn child as a distinct victim when their death is the result of certain violent acts. This statute in Louisiana mirrors a broader legal precedent established at the federal level with the Unborn Victims of Violence Act of 2004. It is because of this legal structure that the killing of Lintel Washington and her unborn child remains a reference point in national conversations about violence toward pregnant women and how American law assigns culpability for the loss of both a mother and her child. Charlene Henderson, at around 3:04 a.m. On May 16, 2022, Charlene Henderson placed a 911 call from her residence in Shreveport, Louisiana. She informed the dispatcher that she and her husband, Larry Clark, had been in a heated argument that ended with her shooting him. She also stated that a firearm was still present in the home. That recorded call established the first official point in a timeline that would be meticulously dissected in the First Judicial District Court of Caddo Parish and later by the Louisiana Second Circuit Court of Appeal. As officers approached the home, even before stepping inside, they were met with the overpowering smell of gasoline. Once inside, they discovered the body of Larry Clark in the bathroom, concealed beneath a section of carpet. Subsequent reports and testimony would reveal he had been drenched in gasoline, and investigators noted the presence of ashes under the carpet that covered him. These disturbing details, captured in crime scene photographs, became the foundation of the prosecution's theory that the scene was deliberately manipulated after the shooting. But the true timeline, investigators would learn, did not start with that 911 call. As the investigation unfolded, authorities performed a forensic data extraction on a cell phone linked to the crime scene. The analysis uncovered a pivotal piece of data. At approximately 2:40 a.m., nearly 25 minutes before the emergency call was placed, a photograph was taken of Clark and the immediate area around him. That picture was then sent to a family member. At trial, this sequence was presented as a chilling timeline for the jury. First the photograph, then the call for help. The actions within that silent gap became the most scrutinized element of the state's case. The physical evidence recovered from the residence only added to the mystery. Officers had secured a handgun at the scene. However, expert testimony from the firearms examination revealed a critical inconsistency between the weapon they found and the bullets that caused the fatal wounds. According to the appellate record, ballistic analysis confirmed that the recovered projectiles were of a different caliber than the handgun police had located inside the house. This single fact created a profound contradiction between the weapon found at the scene and the forensic evidence of the shooting itself. The placement of the firearm in relation to Clark's body became another point of severe contention. Testimony would later confirm that an earlier cell phone picture showed no gun anywhere near him. Yet, subsequent crime scene photographs clearly documented a weapon lying close to his head. This glaring discrepancy fueled the prosecution's theory that the entire scene had been meticulously staged. Henderson took the stand, fighting for her own narrative. Her testimony was a desperate plea. She insisted that she shot Clark because she was terrified for her life. She recounted for the jury a paralyzing fear that gripped her in the moments leading up to the shooting. The appellate court's opinion later summarized her defense. She claimed to believe Clark was reaching for a weapon, and she fired because she was certain he was about to kill her. But the prosecution had another charge, one that would fundamentally alter the dynamics of the case. Henderson was a convicted felon with a 2004 manslaughter conviction on her record, making her possession of any firearm in Louisiana a serious crime. Records showed her prohibition from owning a firearm was active until the year 2029. This led prosecutors to charge her not only with second-degree murder, but also with possession of a firearm by a convicted felon. On June 26, 2024, a jury of 6 men, 6 women deliberated for less than 2 hours before delivering their verdict, guilty on both the murder and the firearm possession charges. On July 16, 2024, Judge John D. Mosley, Jr. presided over the sentencing. He handed down the mandatory sentence for the murder, life in prison. He then added a consecutive 20-year term for the weapons charge, ensuring it would begin only after the life sentence concluded. Henderson's legal team filed an appeal, centering their argument on the state's supposed failure to disprove her self-defense claim. But on July 16, 2025, the Louisiana Second Circuit Court of Appeal upheld both the convictions and the back-to-back sentences. The court found that the trial evidence was more than sufficient for a jury to reject her story of self-defense and find her guilty on all counts. The final judgment underscored a harsh legal truth. Cases blending domestic violence with illegal firearm possession often create complex, overlapping consequences. In this instance, the murder conviction alone carried a mandatory life sentence. The charge of being a felon in possession added even more time, a stark demonstration of how Louisiana's firearm laws function as a separate, powerful legal tool. Derek Kendall Rayborn. The new year had just begun. It was the first day of 2024, a little after 4:30 in the morning. While most of Calcasieu Parish lay sleeping after the midnight festivities, a disturbing call came in. A woman had appeared at a local hospital bearing signs of a brutal assault. Her words to the medical staff were urgent and horrifying. She claimed her boyfriend had murdered her son and their dog at a home located off U.S. Highway 90 East, near the Oakhurst Mobile Home Estates. That single, chilling statement launched law enforcement into what would become the first homicide investigation in Calcasieu Parish for the year 2024. When deputies arrived at the residence, they discovered a grim scene. 26-year-old Eric Bosley of Lake Charles and a dog were both dead from what appeared to be gunshot wounds. The severity of the woman's own injuries painted a picture of extreme violence. Investigators would soon piece together the timeline, confirming that a domestic argument had spiraled into a murderous rage. The name they had for their suspect was Derek Kendall Rayborn. From the initial reports, the relationships were tragically clear. Rayborn was the boyfriend of Bosley's mother. Inside their home, that relationship had fractured into a violent, physical struggle. According to official statements later issued by the Calcasieu Parish District Attorney's Office, Rayborn had beaten the woman until she was unconscious. When she came to and tried to flee for her life, Rayborn chased her down, dragged her back inside the home, and resumed his vicious assault. It was at this point that Eric Bosley intervened. He refused to stand by and watch his mother be attacked. But as he moved to protect her, Rayborn shot him. Bosley collapsed and died there inside the house. In the midst of this chaotic violence, the family dog was also shot and killed. These harrowing details would be officially confirmed by the district attorney's office after the conviction. Following the woman's desperate report from the hospital, deputies descended on the home and secured the crime scene. At the same time, a critical development was unfolding. Rayborn was found at that very same hospital. Reports suggest he had gone there looking for the woman he had just assaulted. Detectives intercepted and questioned him on site. His arrest followed swiftly, and he was booked into the Calcasieu Correctional Center. The initial list of charges against him was staggering. It included second-degree murder, attempted second-degree murder, and domestic abuse battery resulting in serious bodily injury. It continued with aggravated cruelty to animals and interference with emergency communication, illegal use of a weapon during a violent crime, and possession of a firearm by a convicted felon. Judge Clayton Davis set the bond at a staggering $2,375,000. As the case proceeded toward trial, the formal charges against him began to sharpen. When the jury delivered its verdict, Rayborn was convicted on every count: second-degree murder, second-degree kidnapping, aggravated animal cruelty, and possession of a firearm by a previously convicted felon. The kidnapping conviction was rooted in a terrifying allegation that after she awoke, he physically barred her from leaving the house. But one element of the case never wavered in any official account. Rayborn had a history, 5 prior felony convictions, and prison time already served. This background laid the foundation for the firearms charge and dramatically increased what he stood to lose at sentencing. The trial came to a close in June of 2025. On June 19, 2025, the Calcasieu Parish District Attorney's Office announced the final verdict: guilty, as charged. District Attorney Stephen Dwight framed the outcome as a tragic confirmation of domestic violence's devastating power. The official statement underscored that the case only moved forward because of the survivor's profound courage to escape and to testify. Sentencing was handed down 2 months later, on August 22, 2025, by Judge Lee Hoffos. The judgment was both precise and unsparing. For the charge of second-degree murder, Rayborn received life in prison at hard labor, with no possibility of parole. For second-degree kidnapping, he was given 40 years, also without parole. For aggravated animal cruelty, 10 years. For the firearm possession, 20 years, with no chance of parole. The firearm sentence was set to run concurrently with the others. The rest were to be served consecutively. The total sentence calculated to life imprisonment plus an additional 50 years. Sheriff Tony Guillory publicly called the survivors' wounds unbelievable, highlighting the sheer brutality of the attack that culminated in homicide. But the case's echoes extend far beyond the courtroom walls. Its wider significance is part of a somber, nationwide dialogue. National research and prevention data consistently point to attempts at separation as one of the most perilous moments in any abusive dynamic. When a person tries to break free, the potential for a deadly escalation spikes dramatically. We delve into complex cases like this one regularly on this channel. Subscribe so you never miss the next investigation.